I'm going to tell you a little story about a 2-year block party we've been having in Edmonton, the city that I live, getting to know our lichen neighbors, and in the meantime, getting to know more of the people and getting more people interested in lichen. So the block party, I think, has just begun. And this is a collaborative project. So you can see there's a long list of co-authors on this presentation, including my colleagues at the Royal Alberta Museum, students from the University of Alberta, and volunteers and colleagues with the City of Edmonton. So my neighborhood, you have to kind of travel up northeast of you, and this is the, hopefully you can see my mouse, this is the boreal forest, and then we've got the grasslands, and kind of tucked in that elbow of the boreal is the parkland region of Alberta. And Edmonton just kind of sits in that elbow, and it's a very, well, it's a busy industrial city, I would say, for the most part. Lots of oil and gas activity. It's surrounded by agriculture. It does have some wonderful redeeming features. So a long history of planting boulevard trees, largely ash and elm with some tilia and poplar mixed in. Some remnant stands of parkland, not much, but there's still some of that beautiful aspen rolling riparian zone left. And then this beautiful 74-kilometer ribbon of green that bisects the city. That is the North Saskatchewan River Valley. Edmonton is going actually through a cycle of greening. So when European settlement came and interrupted First Nations and bison use of the landscape, there was a lot of logging and mining and gold sluicing in the river valley, and there was also a very big stand replacing fire. So when our legislature was built, this was what the landscape looked like. About now, we're actually looking at a lot greener, lots and lots of mature trees now, 50 to 100 years old, and so I suspect this is a great time to be looking at our lichen diversity. My day job is not to look at city lichens. I work with a province-wide biodiversity monitoring program. So we have around 1,600 sites across Alberta, and we go corner to corner to corner to corner, monitoring lichens, mosses, plants, mammals, birds, habitat, and reporting on that change over time. But when the pandemic hit, we had our first year. I have not been in the field in about 25 years, was last summer. So it gave us an opportunity to dig into this urban block party we were having. When I'm not at the museum, I sneak across the river and I teach a Lichens of Alberta course every few years at the University of Alberta, and try to give those students a practical experience. So some years they do some work in the herbarium and they might do some databasing and some mapping. This year we decided we wanted to look at the lichens that we were co-inhabiting with in our city. And one of the questions that I often get as a lichenologist is, what do lichens tell us, or what are they good for? And it's one of those double-edged questions that I understand where it comes from. It also makes me nuts. But of course, air quality is one of those places that people who are not knowing much about lichen can become more interested. So we were inspired by a study in Hamilton, Ontario, and we decided we were going to go and survey lichens, kind of European style, index of atmospheric purity style across the city. And we asked some really basic questions. So who were our neighbors and who should we listen to? Which lichens might make good community science biomonitors for the city going forward? We did focus on open-grown boulevard trees. This is a little shot from my neighborhood, and the frost is apropos. We ended up doing this in February, -25 before the wind chill. These poor students don't think they quite knew what they were getting into. But we went to over 200 sites across the city, surveying groups of 5 of these boulevard trees. And the City of Edmonton has a phenomenal open database, and it included a database of all of these trees individually numbered, measured, year of planting inputted. So we had a good database to start with. I'm just going to give it a minute to catch up here. There we go. So we started with a list of about 20 species that I knew occurred in the city from my ramblings, largely in the river valleys. We went and we surveyed, did those 190 sites, and we got a little bit of a shell shock. So 4 of the species we did not find at all. after looking at over 1,000 trees. And another 7 of them only occurred at about 10% of sites, which left our urban biodiversity dominated by these 7 species of Physia, Phaeophysia, Xantho Mendoza, and Flavopunctilia. So this was a little irksome. We thought that can't be the whole story. So what we did is we audited a bunch of those surveys. We went back and we also augmented them. We did more crustose species. We had originally kind of focused on the macros. And even after all of that effort, we only had a list of about 43 species. And even though it wasn't really our initial intent, we decided, that can't be the whole story. We've got to dig in a bit more. So we looked to quite a few other data sources. One of them was iNaturalist and NatureLinks. With NatureLinks is just an Alberta version of iNaturalist. So we pulled all the lichen observations, vetted them, added them to the story. We went into the herbarium at the museum. We have a bit of a databasing issue in Alberta herbaria, and COVID complicated that, but we were able to access about 150 collections, largely from the 70s and 80s. That added, another few species. And then just from my years of, hiking through the river valleys, we added those records as well. And in total, we kind of created this first lichen list for Edmonton. It's not too shabby. So we went from the only reference after a lot of digging was that Edmonton was home to approximately 40 lichens, probably based on those herbarium specimens, to 108, I think, pretty hard fought and confirmed species. So we didn't list a species, even if it was in the literature, unless we saw it and we had a confirmed specimen. But we know we have many more to discover. There's rock gardens, the cemeteries, conifers that need to be surveyed. Not surprisingly, when you do this kind of boots on the ground floristic work, we added some species to the provincial flora. And again, not surprisingly, they were largely crustose. I admit to having a pretty serious macrolichen bias, but this has given me many evenings of learning my crustose flora. So I've really, really enjoyed that. A couple of probably new species to science, one that we've been working on for about 5 years now, that ends up being common in Edmonton, and creating some resources for the public, and some interesting distinct diversity patterns were documented. So I kind of broke them out into 3 groups: our boulevard beauties, the parkland players, and the riparian and ravine residents. And just pointing out the importance of that riparian habitat, it only occupies about 10% of our study area, which was really Edmonton proper, but 62% of the species we documented were only found in that 10% of habitat. So here's the species list, and we're not going to dwell on this, but the new species to Alberta are highlighted in red. These orange guys, we documented them through the ABMI, but we haven't had a chance to formally publish them. So we'll be publishing them as part of this work as new to the province. And then in the green are our new species that need more investigation to be described. So here's the pretty picture part of the program. We're just going to look at some of the beauties, and beauties in the eye of the beholder. I understand that, and some of these are common species that you and I might take for granted, but I do try to step back and see them through the eyes of people that are just learning lichens, and aren't they lovely? So we have lots of chlorolichens in Edmonton, nitrogen-enriched landscape, not surprising. So Xantho Mendoza phalax, Physia stellaris, and Phaeophysia orbicularis. Basically every plot, every tree in Edmonton, you will find 2 or 3 of these guys. Lots of Candelariella and Caloplaca in the broad sense. So here we have Candelariella vitellina, Thalia pyracea, and Caloplaca serena, which is one of my favorites. Turns out most of our little brown crusties are Rhinodina pyrena. So lots and lots of looking at little curvy bean spores. We do have a few other Rhinodinas, but this is by far the most successful one in Edmonton. And then some things that are now called Myriolechus, but used to be Lecanora. This was one of our new species to Alberta, and surprisingly, it occurs not infrequently on boulevard trees. So I'm not quite sure how it evaded detection, but it's quite a cute little thing. So this egg yolk pussy toes with the gray thallus and the pretty little orange or yellowy apothecia. And this one is a surprising one. So we have spent the last few years revisiting herbarium specimens, and we only confirmed maybe, I think, 6 specimens of Candelaria concolor in Alberta. The vast, vast majority of our Candelaria is Candelaria pacifica. So when this started showing up on boulevard trees, we were a bit taken aback, and there's probably an interesting ecological story for us to dig into there. The parkland players, they don't tend to be specific to one habitat or the other. They kind of cross the boundary between those boulevards and the riparian regimes, but you start to see a little bit more of the Xantho Mendoza hastiana. Now, hastiana in Edmonton tends to be pretty cryptic, and it's largely overwhelmed by the Xantho Mendoza phalax, so it can be hard to find, but it's often there. And of course, Physiae polea, lovely maculate thing. Lecanora impudens, and this, one of my favorite Physias, which doesn't really have a proper name yet. The closest we could get to is Affinity dimidiata, and there's some ongoing work with Ted Eslinger and Steve Levitt on describing that thing. Phaeocalisium populneum, we have a decent diversity of calicioids and a new species of what we think is a Phaeocalisium. It's diminutive, so like 0.2 of a millimeter, you know, a little bit hard to detect. We first found this little guy in specimens coming in from the ABMI, and it came in on some dead rose we discovered, which is a new habitat as far as I know for calicioids. And we're showing you it here today because I want you to start looking at the dead rose in your neighborhood. We think this is pretty exclusive to Rosa woodsii. It's got a really cool kind of alien experience when you look at it under an SEM, but you really have to stare at the dead rose to find this guy. Look at the kind of crusty node sections where you're finding some other crustose lichens, and you might find that little species. Another parkland player, Myrialecus sambuci, which is one of the multi-spored Lecanoras. And the riparian ravine residents, as I mentioned, very diverse. And this is the only place we're really finding any kind of cyanolichen, but a really lovely diversity of Peltigera, not a bad Cladonia. I mean, we have about 70 species in the province, so they're represented here, but they're not in full force. We also had a lot of new Licidian and Bioterine species for Alberta coming out of the riparian zones, and kind of thought of them as the pinatas of the lichens. You never knew when you cut into a black Licidian crust what you were going to find. They kind of defied preconceived notions. Beautiful Chenothecas, some that are quite rare in the province. So we have Chenotheca trichialis, Stemonia, which I've only seen about 5 times in Alberta, and this Chenotheca furfracea, which is really very common in Edmonton. You look at some decaying wood right near the base in the river valleys, and you will usually find it. So it's a fun thing to show people. And here was our other Candelaria. So Pacifica is very common in the river valley. So we think that they are showing quite different niches within Alberta. So the challenge we discovered, we had found some lists of species that have been recommended for air quality monitoring, about 45 species in total. We only found about 21 of those species in Edmonton. And of those, 10 of them are only found in the river valleys. So that's not going to help us too much with biomonitoring. And of the remaining 11, 2 are really rare in the tablelands, and 2 are pretty difficult to detect. They're not growing in great abundance. So we're left with a little measly 7 previously recognized biomonitors in the city of Edmonton. The other challenge, this table just shows from those nature applications, we kind of tallied up what lichens people were noticing. So people noticed Peltigera, people noticed Xanthuria in the broad sense. And usually they're decent at identifying them to genus. Species, it's another story. That's a real challenge for people. But unfortunately, a lot of the species that people can detect or that are more perceptible to them are really limited in range. So we have a couple of options, we think. We can do some training, and we can, get crews out there to do maybe some intensive biomonitoring and use a full suite of what we think are good biomonitoring species, including some hard to detect and hard to identify in the field crustose species, especially for new people. Or maybe there's a potential here to do some kind of machine modeling based on photos. So the most common lichen out there is Xantho Mendoza phalax. It's an easy orange pixel to pick out on a little lichen ladder. And we're looking at some options of just quantifying how xanthoma dosophallax is doing across the city as a proxy for some of the other diversity measures that require more expertise. So we did get some patterns. We had a student working with the data, looking at that index of atmospheric purity and mapping it across the city. So here we have kind of our downtown. This is used to be a municipal airport. Here's a major highway going through here and a major highway to Calgary, the industrial sector. It does look like lichens are telling us something about Edmonton, but we definitely need to do some more quantitative analyses with this floristic work now, do some niche modeling before we make any hard and fast recommendations to the city. We're also working on a review of urban lichen diversity with Jesse Allen and a wonderful volunteer, Alessandra Hood, including a pretty comprehensive data set of lichens that have been detected in urban environments across the world. Some of the outreach that this has led to or fed into part of this big block party, we've been working with a graphic designer, and she's done this work called The Living Valley. And it's taking these common lichens that, you know, you and I might underappreciate, and looking at them through an artist's eye and working with artists in the community to do really interesting things and really just appreciate them as we discovered yesterday through some of those amazing presentations. We're doing outreach, we're doing walks in the city, COVID be damned, we're out there in our masks, learning our urban lichens and doing a little bit of creating a booklet for people to learn them. And I really, like I said, I think the block party has just begun. We have a lot more species to learn, and I just want to thank all of the wonderful lichenologists who have supported my team over the last decade, and all the volunteers and members of the public that show great interest and kind of keep us in the wonderment of lichen. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. That was wonderful. And we're a little bit behind schedule. I took too many questions during Megan's session. I'm going to go ahead and ask you one question. It comes from Bruce, and he wants to know, do you have air quality data that you can relate to the spatial patterns of your lichen communities? And he also wants to know, what part of the rosa stems should we inspect when looking for the new Phaeocalicium?
Oh, okay. So the first question is, yes, we have 7 air quality monitoring stations in and around Edmonton. And we did intensive surveys. We did about 25 trees at each of those stations. One of the challenges has been that they don't all measure the same elements. So the one in downtown doesn't measure sulfur, which is like, you know, it's one of the main drivers we think for lichen diversity. So there are some patterns there that we think we can explore, but the data is not super fantastic. Yes, those were apothecia cookies. I have to just mention that from Alessandra. I should have added bonus points if you could ID what the genus was. And then the last question is, where should we look on the rows? So I've found it largely on standing dead stems when you get a dense patch of Rosa woodsii and it persists upright through the winter. And then if you look on the dead stems at the kind of the nodes where the branches are, you know, a little bit thicker in the protected kind of branch crotches of the dead branches, the tall dead branches, you'll often find this. It's not too hard to find in Edmonton, but I have found it on live branches as well. So it's worth a try. I've tried on a lot of different rose species, and I've tried in looking in the Northwest Territories and Saskatchewan, but so far I've struck out outside of Parkland, Alberta. So Bruce, prove me wrong. Find it in your neck of the woods.
And before moving on, this should be a quick question. Amelia is asking, is your Edmonton lichen list published, available online?
Not yet. It's been submitted to publication in Opuscula Philolicenum, so we're hoping to get those reviews back any day now. And the reason we chose that journal is because then we can make it freely available online. It's such a wonderful service to be able to provide for people. So coming soon.